your body is a machine with a limited amount of energy. And so when you're stressed out, when you're sick, hungry, tired, or under stress, you don't think as well as you normally do. You don't have the ability to do all the things you normally do. And yet, one of the funny things that happens is when I'm stressed out, all the little stuff becomes super important. Have you ever noticed that? All the things that your kids are doing wrong, everything that bugs you about your mate, suddenly this needs to be taken care of right now. When
Hello, Reneau. Thank you very much for joining us today.
well, thank you for inviting me. It's good to be here.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And for anybody listening and for anybody that is not yet familiar with who you are and what you do, could you introduce yourself to us?
Sure. I was a marriage family therapist for 20 years and I specialized in anxiety disorders. And then I left that and taught at a local college for quite a while, and then another 20 years. And then now I'm retired. I do speaking, just wrote a new book, and just having a lot of fun with my great granddaughter and that sort of thing. Playing some guitar.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Mm,
And I guess in your time as a counselor, I suppose you've learned a lot about, like you said, anxiety, dealing with other people's anxiety, but I suppose dealing with your
right.
own emotions as well. How did you handle that?
Well, my dad was military, so he was Navy for 20 years, and so he didn't have a lot of emotions other than excitement, anger, that type of stuff. Uh, and it's kind of interesting growing up in that family because I tend to be on the sensitive side, which made me a great counselor for people with anxiety disorders because my personality is very similar to theirs, although I never had panic attacks or anything of that nature. Um, just a fairly mellow person in terms of my personality. Um, but it's quite an interesting journey because I was interested in animals and animal behavior at a young age. My parents both came from farming backgrounds, so we had chickens and rabbits and dog, parrot. Raised sometimes. One time we raised geese and had some steers at one time, and had a variety of animals. And I always just enjoyed that aspect of them, their behavior, and how similar to we are in many different ways. And indeed, that's something that research over the last 20 years has shown that we have the same basic emotional circuits that mammals have. So your dogs, cats, and other animals have the same basic expressions of emotions as we have. We just have this ability to think in a way that they don't, and so our belief systems will sometimes change those the way those circuits work in ways that animals don't. Animals are fairly straightforward. uh, we get hide emotions. We have what are called secondary emotions, pride and uh, patriotism and that type of stuff that expresses those circuits in ways that you don't see necessarily in animals.
And do you appreciate that? Do you appreciate those similarities and the differences? Do you consider that very often?
Oh yeah, I mean it's why we prize our pets, right? They're very pure in how they respond. One of the interesting things about emotions and just communication that people are not aware of is the importance that nonverbal communication plays in communication. And little kids, they read their parents just like dogs and cats do. And then as we acquire more uh, cognitive ability, as we learn how to think and we develop belief systems, then we start, especially language, we start paying a lot more attention to words than we do the nonverbal component, although that's still very big. If you take the simple phrase, I love you, I can say, I love you. I love you. Hey, love you, gal. You know what each one of those mean without my having to explain it because it's hardwired into us to read the nonverbal component of communication. And so that's still there, even though we may be thinking about the words. We get those vibes off of people, that subtle underneath communication, through that nonverbal language aspect. And again, it's just part of how we're wired. We're designed to respond to that. And even though we pay attention a lot to words, it's still there underneath it. And so that emotional component is still part of our communication.
Certainly, certainly. And in terms of, like you said, nonverbal communication, would it, of course, including body language, but also the tone of voice, what you were just presenting, how you say things, what would you say to anybody that is maybe not very aware of their body language in terms of how they present themselves, how they show up in the world? Do you have maybe any recommendations, any potential maybe strategies for people that quote unquote improve their nonverbal communication?
Well, I think really it's not so much trying to consciously control how you're presenting yourself, because a lot of presentation really boils down to what you have to say and those belief systems about I guess confidence. When I got to teach public speaking a few times when they needed somebody to do that, and one of the things that was really important is to emphasize is to have something to say. Uh, I've watched public speakers who had wonderful presentation ability. They were very polished, but they really didn't have anything to say that interested me. And so it wasn't a very good presentation. And at the same time, I'm thinking of this one lady that I watched who had probably the worst presentation style you could think of. And but she was just so engrossing. What she had to say was important and fascinating and just engrossing to you that you forgot about her style and you got involved with what she had to say. So I think bottom line, while presentation style is important and it's nice to polish it when you can, what's more important is to have something to say that's important. It's like if you're out on the street and you're looking for and you're trying to ask directions from somebody, and maybe uh, your English is not that great, or in my case, I'm in another country. I lived in Japan for 2 years, and my Japanese was not great, but at that point in time, I really wanted to get to where I wanted to go, and so I forgot about presentation style and all that other type of stuff, and I was able to communicate very well. In fact, I watched not watched, I read a article once about people that speak many different languages. And one of the things that they said is they call those polyglot people, and they didn't have much concern about grammar and structure, and they're more important. And they just basically would jump into the language and start using it, and that's how they develop their skill. And so I think when you get bogged down thinking about, is my syntax correct? Is my structure right? Am I using the right verbal tense? As opposed to just getting in and using the language and just practicing it. And people will figure it out even if your language is not quite exactly right. If the general words are there, they'll figure it out.
Definitely some hand gestures and we're on
Yeah.
our merry way.
And again, that gets down to again confidence, right? And people that do well. I mean, you see this with kids, right? Kids go into a new country. When I taught in Japan, kids would come in from UK and the US, and within one semester, they were fluent in Japanese. And it's because they just started using it. They didn't worry about how they looked or that sort of thing. And of course, as an adult, then we become very concerned with, gee, did I make a mistake? And I think that's probably the biggest thing is people get overly concerned about am I making a mistake? Am I looking awkward? Am I being foolish? And once you can put that aside, then and just start, communicating, then that's really an important key. Um, that those ideas of again, how do I look? Am I okay? Are so important.
And how would you recommend doing that? Like you said, gaining that confidence, moving those fears aside. How can people do that?
Well, it gets down to your self-image, your perception of who you are as a person, and if you grew up in an environment where there was a lot of criticism, or maybe you had parents who modeled that overly concern about appearances, uh, then that's something that maybe take a look at. That if I make a mistake, I guess, and let's talk about mistakes. What are mistakes? Mistakes are just gifts of learning. And that's one of the things that I found people that were really perfectionistic we would work on is coming up with things that they could start to tell themselves about it's okay to make mistakes. In fact, people that are very successful, they make a lot of mistakes, but they see them as learning opportunities. Every time I say something in the case of language, if I'm not saying it right, as I learn how to say it better, then that's my improvement, right? And making mistakes. Oh, that didn't work. So let me try something different, as opposed to, oh my gosh, I made a mistake. I'm a terrible person. What are they thinking of me? That sort of approach to it. And that takes practice because if your personality and if your childhood experience and your learning has been that, I can't make mistakes, I got to do things right, or, I can't look foolish, I have to be adult like, then that's something to work on. Little kids, they don't worry about mistakes. It's fun, watching little kids because they just, you give them an object and they see how many different ways. What can I make it? I can make it a hammer. I can make it a train. I can make it a person. They come up with all kinds of creative ways of dealing with things. And if you can get that childish aspect of play going, then it makes things easier. And it's hard because a lot of adults have learned that it's childish to play, so I shouldn't play, right? I have to be an adult all the time. So the more you can let go of that and say, okay, I can be an adult and I can still play and I can still have fun and I can still use things, I can make mistakes and I can learn from mistakes and I don't have to, beat myself up over those things.
You're very right, Renaud, and I feel like it's exactly what you're talking about, the mindset towards those mistakes that, oh, I'm a
Mhm.
terrible person and I should never ever speak that language again,
You're
versus,
right.
okay, I might have maybe said something wrong, but I can learn from that. Okay, so it shouldn't be A, it should be B. And like you said, embracing that, because if you don't ever practice, then you won't ever make mistakes, that's true. But you won't
Yeah.
ever improve either, so it's a little bit of a trade-off, perhaps.
Yeah, but my wife is Japanese American, and it's interesting because her parents, came from Japan, and like a lot of second generation people, she became fluent in the language because she came over when she was 2, and they didn't because again they stayed within their community and they just learned very rudimentary English, and that's where they got to in their communication abilities. Whereas you saw with not only with that family but other families I know where they're second generation, the kids just go out there and they start practicing and they pretty soon they become very fluent in the language, whereas the parents hold back, they don't practice it except for where they have to, like at the store or something like that nature. And they would use their kids a lot for translators rather than going in and just, practicing and learning and gaining that ability.
And would you say that aligned with that, like you said, perhaps those childhood experiences, perhaps those fears that we hold, would you say that those are somewhat connected to certain maybe emotional triggers in terms of how do you become aware of that, maybe?
Well, it's just paying attention. And again, a lot of cultures are pretty uptight. And there are a lot of places in the world where things are fairly rigid. And so you carry that rigidity into, a situation like here in the US where you have a lot of freedoms. And you see that from people that come out of cultures and places, where there's very very militaristic, strict governments, and where you have to act in certain ways, otherwise bad things happen to you. And so you develop a lot of very rigid should must ways of thinking because that's how you survive. And in the same way, if you grow up from a tradition, again, my mom was German, right? So there's a certain amount of that rigidity that came into, my childhood when I was raised. Uh, and just again, it was important where she was raised and within her family, not important where I'm at and the type of people I deal with. Again, because I don't have police state, I don't have, that rigidity around me in the situations I'm in. And so learning that those should must rules that maybe you need to take a look at them, when you think in terms of should and must, and that's a common form of what they call distorted thinking. Uh, then it's like this invisible parent is following you around, making you do things you don't want to do. Uh, when I was teaching, I would sometimes to demonstrate this, tell the kids, you don't have to come to class. And they'd say, well, I have to come to class, otherwise I'm going to flunk. And then if I flunk, I'm not going to get my degree, and then I'm not going to be able to get the job I want. And so I would say, well, okay, so you're choosing to come to class because you don't want those bad things to happen. And I think it's kind of looking at life as a series of choices, and we choose to do things because we get some good stuff or we avoid some bad stuff. Now, within that context, I make rules for myself. for example, I like to be on time. My family was very rigid, military family. You're very rigid about being on time. You always get there half hour early, right? Uh, and in the Depression era, where my mom and my dad grew up, that was important because there were, 10 people waiting for that job. And if you didn't show up on time, they just would throw you out with no recourse. And being on time was super, super important. And also in the military, of course, it's very important. Um, but if I'm just going over to my friend's house for a get together and I've got this rule, I have to be on time, and there's a traffic jam, then in my thinking, I start thinking, oh my gosh, I have to be on time. I can't be late. This is awful. Why is this happening? I start yelling at the cars, driving crazy, as opposed to, I like to be on time. And so what I tell people to do, start substituting the words I like or I want. I want to be on time. I like to be on time. There's a traffic jam. I'm not. So what am I going to do about it? So the idea is if you've got a rigid should must rule, you don't get into what am I going to do about it? You stay stuck in, oh my gosh, this is terrible. I got to be on time. I can't be late. I have to be on time. As opposed to, again, what am I going to do? Am I going to call ahead? Am I going to just try to find another route? Am I just going to get there and tell them what happened when I got there? And sit back and listen to the music. And again, a lot of those rules, as I was working with people, I started identifying a lot of my rules and how rigid I was about them. And
Hmm.
it's softened me in a lot of areas of my life. So it's good that way. Uh, I misplaced my wallet yesterday, and you know, most people just go nuts over that. I just said it's going to turn up. I'm just going to keep going on. And sure enough, I found it about 2 hours later, and no big deal. Uh, and I knew, okay, if I don't find it within another couple hours, I'll have to call in and, maybe get a new license. And I checked, online, and nobody used my credit card. So I knew it was in the house someplace. It was just a matter of spending some time waiting for it to come up. So those are the types of things that, again, when you're out in a new culture or something, can really make a person very rigid about how they're trying to approach language. And as opposed to, again, what we were talking about earlier, having that more light-hearted kind of, okay, I'm not very good at it. I'm going to make mistakes. And so what? I find people accept you. Most people will accept you in the same way that you would accept them. Again, going back to the public speaking classes, a lot of the uptightness that people would have with public speaking difficulty came again from when they were younger. Oftentimes, junior high school is a very animal time for kids, right? Kids can be extremely cruel to each other and tease each other, But in the adult world, most adults are going to treat you with the same kindness that you would treat others. There's a few that aren't. They're still stuck back in, junior high school and their personality. But most adults are going to accept you just as you accept them. And if you were talking with somebody who didn't know your language very well, you would be okay with that. You wouldn't be laughing at them and thinking horrible things about them. And so, in the same sense, other people will be treating you in that same way. So, most people are going to be kind. Those that don't, they don't matter in the long run. You're going to run into a couple of bozos, but they're not that important. In fact, I use the phrase the people that matter don't mind, the people that mind don't matter.
I like that. I like that.
Yeah.
But it's a very good point, and I feel like a lot of people get stuck in the just the one way because okay, I can't speak English, and so if I speak English wrong, if I make mistakes, they're gonna think that I'm stupid. But then if it works the other way around, if they try to speak your language, be it Spanish, Portuguese, Japanese, whatever, will you think that they're stupid? No, of course not. They're trying to learn my language. Well, you just answered your own question.
Yeah, you're in the adult world now, and adults don't mind about that little stuff. But again, in our mindset, sometimes we feel emotionally like I'm still in the seventh grade, and all these kids are so there's all that peer pressure for your status and where you're in the pecking order. And no, you're in the adult world now.
I feel like what you're talking about comes into Stoicism very nicely. What you were talking about with the wallet, for example. Well, you lost it, and the only thing that you can do is look for it because there is no need getting angry. That's not really going to help you find it. Same with the traffic jam. You can't really control the traffic jam, but you can control how you react to it.
Yeah, I used to tell my clients, I'm a positive realist, right? Uh, Sometimes reality is not great. but it's we got to deal with it, And so, yeah, I'm very much real. I'm an optimist too. I expect the best, but sometimes it doesn't happen. So you just figure out how am I going to approach it, become problem solving approach to life as opposed to stuck in the way things should and have to be when they're not.
Certainly, certainly. And I also wanted to talk to you about assertiveness a little bit because I feel like that's a very
Mhm.
important communication skill, a very valuable skill. How would you navigate that, especially from what you were talking about, maybe being in a new culture, but even within your
Right.
own, what would you recommend for that?
Well, in the English speaking world, we tend to be fairly direct. I know now my wife with the Asian culture, a lot of indirect communication. Uh, but which again, would American businessmen would go over in Japan, a lot of times it's hard for them because they have to build consensus and everything's kind of indirect. And English is much more direct in how it asks for things. And so, yeah, asking for things directly is important. And I think when it comes to assertiveness, again, assertiveness, we're talking about conflict resolution. So um, there's three basic styles to resolving conflict, and it exists along a continuum, right? So at one end, you have the person who basically is non-assertive or who just allows the other person to get their needs taken care of. And then at the other, because again, needs is the other thing we're thinking about in terms of conflict, because when there's two people together, there's conflict. I want to have Chinese food. You want to have Mexican food. Oh, we have a conflict, right? I want to watch this on TV. You want to watch that. We have a conflict. How do we resolve that? So there's that non assertive thing where you just let the other person have their way. Then at the other end of the spectrum, we have the aggressive. I'm going to get my way. I don't care about you. And then in the middle is where we call the assertiveness, where we're trying to come up with what's called a win-win situation, where we both come up with a solution that's going to be, we may not get the whole piece of cake, but we'll get some of it so that we're both satisfied, right? And the other thing about assertiveness is all three styles can be appropriate depending upon the situation. So that's the other thing is being able to move from one to the other style depending upon what your circumstances are. If I'm again in a rigid culture, or if I've got a robber who's got his gun trained on me or something like that, I'm going to be very non-assertive, right? You want my wallet? Take it, I don't
I
care.
just found it.
Yeah. And again, if I'm playing football or something, I'm going to be aggressive, right? Because I want to win. I don't care about you. And there's a lot of situations when you're dealing with very aggressive personalities, where if you're trying to be assertive, you're not going to win. You got to get more. You got to move up towards more of that aggressive side if you're dealing with that. Again, in the standard English world, the assertive approach will work most of the time. Not always, but most of the time. And so, being able to put out what you want in a direct way. And that is probably the other part of it is when you deal with couples, for example, and you're trying to teach them how to have, fair fighting and assertiveness. One of the things you run into is you have to first decide, what do you want? And, I would be working with a couple and I'd say, okay, so what do you want in this situation? Well, they do this. And I can't stand it when this happens. Oh, this is awful. So what do you want to have happen? And then I really don't like. So and then you can go out for 15 minutes before they finally say, this is what I would like to have happen. So when you've got something, I think the first step is to decide, what do I want? And then you just phrase that using what we call an I message. I would like such and such, and you try to do it in a direct way without a lot of blaming the other person. Because again, depending upon the situation, sometimes we get sidetracked with all the bad things this other person's doing, and we want to address that as opposed to what do I want in this situation. So you ignore all that other stuff, and this is what I want. And then sometimes you have to listen, because when you're negotiating with a person, oftentimes the first step is to listen to what the other person wants and to say that back to them. So you would like this. Okay, I understand that, but here's what I want. Simple situation. Person's always being late, picking you up for work, right? Uh, well, I need to leave by 8 o'clock so I get there on time. Now, what are they going to do? They're going to give you all the reasons why they've been late and it's not their fault, right? And so, okay, I understand that, but what I need is I need to leave by 8. Otherwise, I need to make some other arrangements. And so you just keep coming back to here's what I want, and I understand. And you listen to them, and you maybe parrot back. I understand that was difficult for you, but still, this is what I need to have happen. And hopefully, then you can start to negotiate, something that'll be working for both of you. And again, understand that some people are what we call non-negotiators, right? They're not going to negotiate fairly with you no matter what you do. And so in that case, you've got to decide either I'm going to become compliant, non-assertive and give them their way, or I'm going to say, okay, I'm sorry, this is the limit I have, and you go with that. So
Certainly.
in a nutshell, that's kind of assertiveness.
But I
Yeah.
very much like what you said, Renaud, and I'd love to come back to what you said in terms of strength within you to say, okay, this is what I can handle. Like you said, this is the limit that I have, and we are not going any further than that. But like you said, coming back to perhaps those cultures that are not very compliant with having limits potentially, how can people develop that in themselves if they've always just said, okay, yes, yes, that's fine, we can do it your way. How do you get to
Y-
that point?
You see that a lot with women who come from a culture where they don't have a lot of power, and they'll come into the US and they have all this freedom, but they still act as if they don't. And one of the key issues comes into buying into the concept that I have some rights, and I have the right to be treated with respect. I have the right to ask for what I want. And a lot of times it's a matter of even putting those on a card and just, reading those every day until you convince yourself that I really do have the right to set some limits. I do really have the right to be safe. I have the right to ask for what I want. Uh, and depending upon, the situation, buying into that. And once the person buys into that concept, then their behavior changes. You can teach them assertive skills, you can teach them all kinds of skills, but they first have to believe that, I really do have the right to be treated with respect, to ask what I want, to be safe, and then I'll act on it once I believe that. If I don't believe it, then I'm not going to act on it.
And do you think this falls into a visualization kind of situation? I am this, I do this, I have this kind of scheme?
It can. People, they process it differently. For some people, visualizing themselves, acting assertively and doing the behaviors is important. But even underneath that, I think it's more just your belief system about who you are and what you're able and what you deserve. Maybe it might be a good way of saying it. Uh, one of the things that's a kind of a concept within Western culture, it comes out of the Judeo-Christian, tradition, is that people, originally it was the idea that people are the image of God, and so as that, they have the right for respect and be treated fairly, and so that's permeated into Western culture and the idea of individual rights. uh, People do have the right to be safe and to be protected, to ask for what they want. And if you can buy into that concept, and that becomes part of how you look at other people as well, other people have the right to be treated with respect and dignity, just as I have the right to be treated with dignity and respect. And then that becomes just kind of who you are and how you deal with people.
Certainly. And with situations that perhaps push us to the limit, I do want to dive into also stress management, also from the perspective of what we were talking about before, new culture, new country, new language, perhaps that is very, very stressful for a lot of people. What do you recommend for that?
Well, stress, there's a lot of sources of stress. And the sources of stress that you have the most control over, of course, are those internally generated sources of stress. Time pressure, the desire or the need to do things in certain ways, and fit in and that type of stuff. Some of that stuff you can't do anything about. But you can work on those internally, again, those should must rules that you have. Um, and I think the other thing is understanding that you do have limits. When I work with stress management classes, one of the things I try to get people to do is to identify their stress indicators. So, like when you drive your car, you've got little lights on your dashboard that tell you, the oil, this or that's going on. you have indicators that you do that tell you that stress is starting to get to you. Um, so in my case, again, I mentioned my dad's Navy military background. When I get really stressed out, sometimes there's a change in how I use language, right? So some of his language comes in. Uh, or sometimes if I've got something that's chewing on me, I'll sit there in front of the computer and I'll be doing a little computer game things. And it's just, we all have behavioral things that we do when we're under stress. And just being aware that these are my stress indicators. And when I am under stress, then I need to decide how I'm going to use my energy. Your body is a machine with a limited amount of energy. And so when you're stressed out, when you're sick, hungry, tired, or under stress, you don't think as well as you normally do. You don't have the ability to do all the things you normally do. And yet, one of the funny things that happens is when I'm stressed out, all the little stuff becomes super important. Have you ever noticed that? All the things that your kids are doing wrong, everything that bugs you about your mate, suddenly this needs to be taken care of right now. When and then
Yeah,
when you're
this
not
is the
stressed,
perfect time.
yeah, and that's when you really should shut up and not do anything, right? So when you notice yourself stressed out, when your little lights and your stress indicators are going off, then that's when you need to decide, okay, what's important? I'm going to take care of that. Everything else, I'm just going to let go until I'm a little bit more, have more energy and I have more my wits about me. Because you really don't think as clearly when you're under stress as when you're relaxed. And again, some people have this mistaken idea that I can make myself act at 100% regardless of what's going on in my life. And that's not true. We see these movies where the guy has been shot, he's been thrown out of the airplane, he's been run over by a truck, he's been beaten up, and he's still trucking along. In real life, that doesn't work. That doesn't happen. And we do have limits. Our body is a machine. It has a limited amount of energy. And some days your tank is full, and some days you're running on fumes. And so on those days when you're running on fumes, you decide what's important. That's what I need to focus on. And everything else I just put on the side and I'll get to it later on when I'm less stressed out. That's probably the most important thing. So when you come into a new country and you got a lot of stuff that you're juggling, you're trying to figure out housing, you're trying to figure out work, you're trying to figure out this and that. Uh, Stay with the important stuff. All the little stuff, just it's not important. Uh, it can happen later on.
And would you recommend deciding those important factors before you get stressed out, or is it more of a
It's nice if you
dynamic
can.
process?
It's nice if you can, but I mean the way life is, we don't always do that. So when you are stressed out, just ask yourself, what's the most important thing I need to do? What do I need to focus on now? And focus on that. And these other little things will kind of, they'll chirp at you on the sideline, but you just say, okay, you're not important. I need to deal with this. And you deal with whatever it is that's most important at that time, and stay focused there. And that's a kind of a training yourself to do that, because again, it is so easy when you're stressed out to just waste your energy with a lot of nonsense stuff that doesn't need to be dealt with at that moment. And so just training yourself, okay, when I'm my stress indicators are going off and I'm not feeling good and things are going on, focus on what's important. Just take care of that.
And do you have any tips or tricks potentially to get less stressed if, let's say, you get to this level, to maybe try to get to that level instead?
Well, I think again, your biggest stressors are the internal sources of stress. All those should must rules and things you have. But a lot of times there are real things on the outside that you need to deal with. Uh, when I worked with people who had panic attacks, typically they were very out of touch with their what's going on. They're very perfectionistic. I'd ask them, so when you had your first panic attack, what was going on? And they'd say things like, well, I was working full time, I was going to school, taking care of my dad because he was sick, and oh yeah, my fiance decided didn't want to get married, so I don't understand why I had the panic attack. And it's like, you say, back up the truck, I think I figured it out here. What they were having was a stress reaction,
No.
because they're, as a group, they tended to have reactive bodies anyway, which turned out to be a blessing because it was they had to take care of issues as they came up. So sometimes we have things going on in our life, whether it's work related or whether it's relationships, whatever it happens to be. And we just keep pushing and pushing. Our body is telling us that, uh, this is an issue you need to take care of. And typically they would say, well, it wasn't that big a deal. And I'd say, well, your reaction is telling me it is a big deal, so maybe you need to address the issue. And so if you're stressed out, what we would do is we would go through the checklist. So how's your primary relationship doing? How's, the kids, how are the kids doing? How's work? How's your friendships, your major life goals? And at some point in there that, usually people would say, well, this is happening, but it's not that big a deal. I can handle it. Well, maybe it's something you need to look at. So just going through the checklist, again, your mate, kids, work, friendships, major life goals, any other important things happen lately. And usually at some point you say, this is going on, and then deal with it. Again, this tendency to say, it's not that big a deal, I can handle it, I think is the biggest thing that causes it a lot of stress that people don't recognize.
And if we circle back a little bit to what you started talking about with recognizing when you get stressed and don't letting that perhaps overcome you, if we can maybe
Mhm.
think of it that way, what would you recommend to a person that is already there, that is already, okay, I started the fight, I started the screaming match. How
Yeah,
do we
yeah.
make it out from there?
Well, I think the first step is do nothing. Take a time, take a time out. When you work with anger management, one of the things that's really important to lock into place is the walk away strategy. When you're highly emotional, you can't think straight. And so sometimes you need to just get away for a few minutes to calm down and regain your thinking ability, because most people can then kind of look at the situation in a more objective way. But when you're really wound up and you're stressed out, that's not the time to make a lot of decisions and to try to figure things out. So sometimes it's a matter of do something, whatever it is, whatever your process is, whether it's taking a walk, whether it's playing with a dog, whether it's doing a video game, or whatever it is that you use that kind of unwinds you, you know, do that. If you're at work or something, sometimes it's a matter of just, I got to go to the bathroom and just sitting there for a moment, to kind of get control of yourself, calm down so you can think of the situation more calmly. Uh, One thing that's, I've been married to 49 years now. Your mate is sometimes very good at pointing these things out. I think you're getting a little wound up here. So sometimes that's an indicator too.
Trusting the signs, definitely.
Yeah.
And Renaud, can you talk to us a little bit about some of the perhaps misconceptions that you've heard from other people, perhaps even other professionals with the field of communication, emotions, stress management, all of the different topics that we broached? Any misconceptions that we should be aware
Oh shoot, there's a lot of them. With anger, for example, a lot of people will say it's good to vent anger, and
of?
no, it's not. You're just
Mm.
practicing being angry. That's all you're doing. Uh, Anger is something, all emotions, they're there to be managed, and you act upon them. You don't act them out. And I think, a 2-year-old acts out their emotions, as an adult, we can control ourselves and we act upon our emotions. Again, we don't have to act them out. Emotions are information. And I think that's the other thing is emotions are communicating to you information about needs and wants that either are being dealt with and being met, or needs and wants that are not being met. And so when a need is not being met, uh, if you don't do something about it, it keeps pushing on you. And it may come out as anxiety, it may come out as anger, it'll come out in some way. So it's important to address this is a need, and I need to meet it. Now, sometimes, you're not able to meet a need, right? Maybe I'm single and I really would like to have a relationship, and that's a need that's there, but it's not being met. Okay, are there some other ways I can meet that, since I have not found, Mr. or Mrs. Right? Uh, I need to maybe have some friendships. I need to have some other places where I can have relationship with people that will at least in part meet some of that need that I'm feeling. And just being aware of this is something that I need is important. And just I might mention that when you talk about things that make people happy, because at the end of the book, I talk about the three things that positive psychology has identified. And one of the big ones is relationship, having an intimate relationship with people where you can be transparent and yourself and you can communicate to them. And people used to have all kinds of relationships like that. People used to grow up in a village, or they'd have their block, or they'd have their extended family. And so they had lots of people. And this might be a problem a lot of times when people go into a new country is they're isolated. So finding those relationships becomes super, super important. Unfortunately, with the younger generation, especially now, social media is meeting a lot of that, and it's not really meeting it. I have 500 Facebook friends, but I don't have anybody I can really talk to in a real way. And the other problem, of course, is something called fear of missing out. You see all these people having wonderful lives, doing all these great things, and I'm not. And in reality, they're not either. It's just that what you're seeing, on the web and their social media, it makes it look like it's important. Everybody's living the life of the Kardashians, and even they aren't living that life. Uh, so having real people that I'm having face-to-face conversations with is important. The saddest thing for me is to go out to a restaurant and to see, the parents both on their phones and the kids on their devices, and nobody's talking. There's no relationship going on. And if you've got people that you can talk to and be transparent with and have a good relationship, then you don't have to worry about your mental health. And I think, especially, when I went into Japan, I had a job. So we lived there for 2 years. And I was teaching at a what's called an international school. And so I immediately had a lot of friends and stuff and people that I could start to engage with and develop some friendships with. And so that was important. And so if you go into a new area of the country or a new country, it's important to find some people that you can have that part of your life met, and that will help to insulate some of the other stuff that's going on with the stresses and just the tensions of having a new environment that you're in.
And what are some of the things that you did, and perhaps some of the things that you can recommend, like you said, moving to Japan and making friends, starting to make friends? How did you go about that? Where did you meet new people, perhaps, or how do you start those conversations?
Well, with me, of course, it's finding people that come from the English speaking community, right? And that was an initial group. So you find somebody, if you can, within your cultural group, and that's a starting place, right? And of course, then I met other people, Japanese people, that I became friends with. That took a little bit longer, because sometimes it's harder to break into a different culture. Um, but I think starting with your own interest, if you have, like, if you're a bicycle person, you find a bicycling group, or if you have something else, like I play guitar, so I had some musicians, that's always for me an immediate source of connection, right? Is if we make music, we don't have to speak a whole lot, but we can still have a lot of fun playing music. So finding some areas of interest, things that you enjoy, and then finding some other people. And that's one of the positive things I think of social media. You can go on the internet and you can find all kinds of groups in your area that do the things that you like to do, and that's another place that you can hook into. Certainly, churches a lot of times will form for people an entry place. So social clubs, churches, any kind of community activity that has something that you enjoy, that's where you start to meet people and make those connections. And it's important to understand too that not everybody has the space for you. In the old days, you'd go to a dance and you'd have a card, and you still go, I'm going to do the waltz, and this person's going to do the foxtrot. So you'd have a dance card, right? And so I use the analogy that sometimes a person's dance card is full in terms of friendships, right? They don't have room for another person. Don't take it personally. It's just, I've tried to go to have coffee with them. I've tried to go to lunch with them. I've tried to invite them, but they're always busy. It just means their dance card is full. It doesn't mean somehow I'm inadequate. So you just have to keep asking people until you find somebody whose dance card has an opening space, and then you'll fit in there, and you guys can have some fun times together.
Very nice analogy, Renaud. And to come
Yeah.
back to what you were talking about with your book, for anybody interested in learning more about your book or perhaps wanting to read it, where can people find your book?
It's available in paperback and ebook and audio, but you can go to whyemotions.com. So why emotions.com, and I have links to all the different places and my YouTube videos and just all kinds of stuff. So whyemotions.com.
Wonderful, wonderful. And do you have any final words of wisdom, any final advice that we haven't maybe touched on, but you'd like to share?
Well, I think when it comes to if you're working with a new language and a new culture, um, lighten up. you know, we take ourselves so seriously sometimes, and sometimes it's a matter of just saying, okay, I'm going to mess up, and it's okay. I'm can be a messy person. I can still enjoy life. I can still succeed, and I can have fun with it. So have fun with things. Don't be so serious in life.
Perfect. Very good piece of advice. Well, thank you,
Yeah.
Renaud, very, very much for your time, for all of the amazing tips and advice that you've shared with us today. And I'm very, very sure that anybody that listened today has learned a lot from you.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, I'm glad to see you here. Let me know what you most enjoyed about this conversation, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I'll see you in the next one. Do zobaczenia.